Welcome to the We Do Performance podcast with your hosts, Dr. Andrew Usher and Dr. John Babraj.
So welcome to the We Do Performance podcast. This is podcast number 1, which means John Babraj is now a social media content creator. How's that feel, John? Allegedly. So for people that don't actually know us from other podcasts that may unfortunately be listening to this, we should probably introduce ourselves. So John, go first. Do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm John. I'm senior lecturer at Babraj University in exercise physiology. My PhD was in muscle protein synthesis in response to exercise and nutrition, with a first look at how the extracellular matrix proteins respond in these situations. Since then I've been researching sprint interval training for the last almost 20 years now, and there's still much more we need to know about it. So roughly that's a quick overview of me.
So I'm obviously Andrew Usher, so I guess exercise physiologist, did my PhD with John, so it's kind of interesting. And my PhD was all on muscle action skeletal kinetics. And both John and I are pretty unique in that we work with a lot of elite athletes. So, and those athletes range in all sports. Typically, I guess people think of us as combat sports, but actually that's not quite true. So the idea of this podcast is to kind of really dive into that whole big world of performance in all sports. And really what I was thinking with devising the podcast was that John and I often have crazy batshit conversations in the coffee shop over weird stuff. And a lot of that weird stuff is pretty cool and it's really relevant. And I just thought it'd be kind of nice to kind of capture that kind of sense of just informal chit chat. And we'll do it over 3 different styles. So we might do like research review podcast where we'll just dive into a paper, which might be quite useful, break it down, give our thoughts and opinions on it. And then we'll do, like today, a deep dive where we're going to go into our own paper. And then we're going to have some nice featured guest episodes. So we get some nice guests lined up so we can get an understanding of what other people are doing and how they apply it. And I think that could be quite useful for listeners out there. So with that, today we're going to do a deep dive, or attempt to do a deep dive, because both of us have struggled to remember even the bloody title of our paper. So we're going to deep dive into our paper, and I'm having to use some show notes here, which is tragic. The impact in sprint interval training on post-fatigued mitochondrial rate in professional boxers. And I just said to John before we started, not sure why we chose such a long name. Why did we choose such a long name?
Perhaps it sounded fancy at the time.
It might have done. And the thing is like anyone involved in research knows, it's like you write your paper, a lot of times you don't really think of the title, and then you submit it, it might get knocked back, and you suddenly change 4 words in the title, and then it gets into peer review. And it makes no sense. And I think this might have been the case with this. Although I think this one actually got published pretty easily compared to some of the papers in the past. This one was quite well accepted. And the reason I think this is a good one to jump into is I think people associate me and you in other podcasts with this paper. I think, yeah, but I think there's probably a lot more in it than what we really tend to discuss. So I think this will be a really good one for people interested in performance. In the paper, effectively, what we did is we took 10 boxers and we wanted to see what would the changes be after a 3-week intervention on sprint interval training that was basically self-autonomous. So we wanted to take that control away from the lab and just to see in real life what would actually happen. And what we found was some nice adaptations, which we will get to.
I think that's quite a good point to start on, is the whole training protocol was out of the lab. We had no control, other than monitoring heart rate, we had no control over when or what or how the participants chose to do it, what bike they used. We had no control, and that was whatever bike was available, which I think is quite a big statement. As researchers, we like to control everything. We have nice bikes, we can control the intensity really tightly. So this is really one of the first papers that we've allowed that control to go.
And I think it's important. Yeah, and it's important, I guess, because, I mean, obviously my big love is practical research, which is much harder to do. But the reality is a lot of the athletes you train don't really have access to great gyms. They can't afford expensive memberships. So they rock up. If you're lucky, there's like a watt bike So for me, it was really interesting that we did it in a way where they just used what they actually had access to. Because it was also kind of interesting to me to see whether your research was actually bona fide or whether it just was bullshit. Because the thing is like, I think it's, we'll get into this as well in future podcasts, but research is a kind of, it's its own little animal. And I'll be honest, this was a nerve-wracking research project because you're thinking, well, you're leaving people to their own devices. You're giving them some guidance. You're saying, look, heart rate monitor, take a bike, crank the resistance up. But you still get that trepidation of, are they actually going to do it? Are they not going to do it? And what I will say with this paper, though, to caveat, is we were very fortunate that we had athletes that were well-trained professional boxers at a very, very high level. So they were very disciplined in training. And I think that is something we should say, because I think, when you read a lot of research papers and it's like 10 athletes, sometimes those are like university athletes. They're not actually what we class as athletes or elite athletes. These were elite athletes. So I think compliance was probably much easier because of that.
Yeah, I think probably because a lot of the athletes had experienced at least a bike sprint in the lab. They knew what it should feel like, how far they should push themselves. So whilst we say we didn't have control, we gave them the structure that they needed to implement it themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's important because from a practical context, and we see this all the time, and this paper has been really, really popular, and it's seen as have loads of people internationally contact us, everyone from individuals right through to very, very high level Premier League teams and rugby clubs. And it's interesting because people think they're doing sprints, but 95% of the time, they're not doing sprints at high enough intensity. And it's only when they come into the lab environment do they actually experience, shit, this is an all-outer. That first sprint has to be violent. It has to be completely all out.
Yeah. I think it's very easy to hide in intensity. You can look like you're doing a lot of effort whilst holding back. So it's about the athletes realising they've got to give the first sprint's the important one. That's where you've got to put the effort in. What happens after that, we're looking to improve how well you can recover from that first sprint. So if they don't do a first sprint well, we never get the adaptations drop.
Yeah. So I think what we'll do is we'll dive into this now. So that was the aim of the paper, but we're going to go the other way around because I want to touch on like from molecular biochemistry all the way up, because I think there's a misconception over what we do with these sprints. I don't think people realise that these sprints are all about mitochondrial function and change. So the question is, John, I guess, is what the hell is mitochondria?
So mitochondria are everything. For athlete performance or for general health and well-being, it always comes back to mitochondria. So mitochondria are the energy cells or the energy producers for a cell. So within the muscle, if you want to create movement, you need a high level of mitochondria to be working efficiently. You don't necessarily need a huge number of mitochondria. It's not necessarily about getting more mitochondria.
Yeah.
It's about efficiency of the mitochondria. So that the processes that go on, the biochemical processes that are happening in the mitochondria have to happen fast. So from transport in to energy out, we have to have a speed of movement through the whole system. And that speed of movement is where performance comes from. So how fast you can get from energy precursor out at the mitochondria to energy out really determines how easy exercise feels or movement feels.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you see quite a lot, especially undergrads and probably younger coaches, is a misunderstanding that mitochondria have a much deeper function than just ATP production. So I think they think that they're doing things just because they're just getting this kind of excess pool of energy. They're not appreciating things like the role of calcium, the intracellular matrix, how it drives it, inflammation processes, interleukins. So mitochondria are really super important because if you want to have them, you ain't getting muscle contraction.
Yeah. So the mitochondria is not working efficiently, what you'll get is a trap of calcium within the mitochondria, which prevents calcium going into the cross-bridge cycle that creates force. So it's not just about the energy that we produce, but how efficiently we produce the processes it allows. So for example, calcium is a key moderator of a number of enzyme steps in the mitochondria. So it's needed in there for these enzyme reactions to happen fast. But if the mitochondria is not efficient, you have to take more in than's required. So the whole point of training is to try and minimize the amount of calcium it's needed to act as a co-regulator, which then speeds everything up.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing as well about mitochondria is it's a hot topic, and I'll link some papers in the show notes, like Jonathan Mem's paper, and there's some really interesting papers on it. But the reality also is that sprint interval training, because it's got an effect on that, which we'll get to, shows you that mitochondria for longevity purpose is really crucial as well. You know, the work that we do is really focused on that more than anything else, because without it, you're not going to be able to do much. The next question is, well, how do we develop it? How do we train it? I guess that's what everyone's is really interested in. What is the best way of training it? Now, people will know that we're not massive lovers of steady state training. It has its place, and I just want to caveat it because I get some comments online that people think I hate steady state training. I don't hate steady state training. It comes down to sport specificity and what you need for your sport. That's what it comes down to.
I think around training that people misunderstand is the reason why I promote sprints so over moderate intensity continuous training. It is really about time efficiency as well for the athlete and the coaching staff. If I can reduce that fitness requirement down to a 10-minute block, it frees up so much more time for the athlete to do the technical and tactical skills they need for the sport. I think sometimes we've got into a prescriptive way of thinking about training. If we want to do this, we've got to do this. So if we want to build endurance, we have to do zone 2 steady state.
So we know we want to kind of stimulate and we want that kind of mitochondrial biogenesis, and we know steady state training will do that. Your cardiac output training, that left ventricle development, all that good stuff. We know all that works, but it just takes a lot of time. And unless you're working with runners, ultra runners, or athletes that are constantly in that space, finding that time can be really difficult. Really, really difficult.
It also comes at a higher injury risk as well.
Yeah.
When you think about it, any run-based training is putting strain on hip, knee, ankle. So if you're doing that for 2 hours a day, the chances of injury go up.
And that's one of the reasons why I'm not keen on kids that don't have a running background suddenly being told to run 15 and 20 miles a week in a sport that doesn't really need 15 and 20 miles a week. I think, and then coaches go, well, why are they injured? And you go, well, think about what you're doing with them. So I think that's the issue. But there's nothing wrong with steady state training or zone 2 training if you get the time to do it. I just want to clarify that. It will provide adaptations. But I can tell you from our own research that we can get that much quicker. Much, much quicker. It's maybe a bit more aggressive in mindset because you have to do a super maximal sprint. But the crazy thing is we can get quicker adaptations, than the cardiac output training style in a very, very fast period of time. Now, massive benefits to this other than just the mitochondrial side of things. It's like if you have a return to play athlete that's cardiac output and resting heart rate still relatively well, you can get them really functioning back into playing a very fast time sprints.
Yeah, and because of the return to play, if you go and sprint, the load is much less. So you're less likely to see a breakdown in that run up to return to play.
So why does supramaximal sprints promote this mitochondrial adaptation the way that it does, John? What's the mechanisms behind? Why does it do it?
So that's probably still not 100% clear. I would say there's a number of things happening that are crucial for mitochondrial adaptation. One of them is cycle-based sprints or sprint training will create intramyofibrillar glycogen depletion. So essentially, glycogen stored in 3 places in the muscle. But the most important one is the one that's within the muscle fibers. And every time you do supramaximal cycle sprints, you get full depletion of that pool of glycogen.
That can make sense, yeah.
And that acts as a signal for a lot of adaptation.
Yep.
The other thing that's happening is the stress that you're placing on the oxidative system. So people think of sprints as anaerobic in nature. I know you don't like the term anaerobic, but it's one that everyone bandies around.
Yeah.
They think it's phosphocreatine and a bit of glycogen, anaerobic glycogen breakdown. Reality is sprints are highly oxidative. Once you get past the first, probably second of a sprint, mitochondrial switch on is happening. We've got this massive activation of the mitochondria, and that creates stress within the mitochondria. So we've got glycogen depletion, which is a signal for change. We've got stress in the mitochondria, which is a signal for change. And the stress we get in the mitochondria with sprints is much higher than the stress we can create with steady state. So we actually have, for a very short period, a really high demand on mitochondrial function. And the mitochondria has to, or the body, we kind of anthropomorphize and say the muscle has to respond. But essentially we have to respond to that. So if it happens again, we can cope with it. So that's what training adaptation is. It's this adaptation we drive. And that's why we always plateau out eventually in terms of adaptation.
I want to go back onto this whole sprint thing as well, because I see a lot of this, and this is my pet, this alactic training idea, that you're only hitting that PCR system. The brilliant thing about bike sprints is everything is working. And if people are telling you you're only getting, in the first 3 seconds of that sprint, we're doing a 3-second sprint and 3 minutes off, it's all bullshit, because you're getting everything. Intensity is substrate contribution driven. So the higher, so that's it. So you just think intensity drives substrates. It's kind of try to segregate these. I don't know why. Why do people try and segregate these energy systems in a bike sprint?
I think some of it, is to make it sound complicated. People like to make things sound complicated, so that allows them, to go to a client that they understand this, so we can get you better. Sprints are really simple, as you say. Every system is activated. But the important thing about sprints is how you program. You said if we do 3 seconds and then 3-minute recovery. That's not going to create adaptations that you're looking for generally.
No, exactly.
Unless you're looking around power development. Because you're not keeping the stress in the system for long enough. You're allowing too much recovery.
That is the key, is the stress. And this is something we'll touch on just now, because I think this is something people don't understand about our work. Is, say for example, we're doing back-to-back wing gates. We use that as a baseline, because a lot of times athletes come in, they're not really familiar. It's a super easy test to conduct. And from that baseline, we will then derive what sprint should look like for that person. So we have an athlete comes in, then we do 2 weeks of baseline testing, and we determine that heart rate's pretty good, recovery looks relatively reasonable, but we can improve it. So we will give them, say, a 10 on, 15 off, and we'll repeat it, say, 6 times. The only thing that is super important is that first sprint. That first sprint has to be so maximal that it's like a cascading effect that every other sprint is just supporting that metabolic stress. That metabolic stress, that violence in that first sprint is really the catalyst to everything that occurs. If your athlete is going say 600 watts, 600 watts, 600 watts, and then the last sprint is suddenly hitting 1500 watts, then that sprint has not been a super maximal sprint. And I think there's a lot of misconception over why we're using sprints, and I think it's because people are very obsessed with power.
Yes, I think that's a good point. Power is not a very good metric of what's happening inside the muscle. Power power reflects what's happening at the crankshaft of a bike.
Yeah.
It doesn't reflect that point of what's happening in the muscle. So everyone goes, I can hit 1200 watts, I can hit 1600 watts, I can hit 2000 watts. What does it mean? It doesn't matter. Important is the speed of takeoff.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing as well is a lot of these bikes, you got to remember as well, bikes will vary. You can have 2 watt bikes and they'll get completely different readings.
Yeah.
So you have to also remember, which is something we always try and tell students as well, is that none of these values are really fixed absolute values. And power is an external work metric. And I think people have a hard time understanding this. And this is where you get into this messy world of strength and conditioning versus sports science and why sports science trumps strength and conditioning. Right? And everyone will hate me for that. But the reality is physiology is physiology. You cannot take a Newtonian physics component and just naturally assume that that's what the body's actually doing. And for me, power is one of those things. You get people talk about, oh, we're doing power training. It's like, but what do you mean by power training? What are you doing physiologically that is making power?
I think power also assumes a sort of linear transfer of force.
Yeah.
When in fact, if you look under ultrasound, when you watch muscle fibers move, they're not moving back and forward. They move in an elliptical shape. So it's much more a rounded movement. So that power estimate is probably incorrect.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good metric to have because you can benchmark it, assuming you're doing the same bike, so I like athletes being the same all the time. And that
has to be on the same bike. That's
so
really important.
We need the mitochondria. We know sprints can do it in a very efficient way. And the question, so I guess the big question a lot of people have for us is well, how do you assess that change is occurring at the muscle or the peripheral? And I guess this is where I shamelessly plug TrainRed. Or you can use Moxies. So we'll touch on near-infrared spectroscopy and these little devices because these are kind of a bit of an eye-opener for a lot of people. So there is no way, even with these devices, I'm going to caveat this, these are like proxy measurements, they're not spot measurements. There's no way to really, what's going on is on the muscle tissue really. Biopsy, maybe.
Again, people think biopsy is the gold standard, but what you've got to remember is a lot of time that biopsy is taken at rest, probably around about 20 to 30 seconds after the exercise is ceased. So it's not, the practicalities of taking tissue out limit what's actually being seen.
But the interesting thing about that is if you think near-infrared spectroscopy, so you put one of these devices, slap it in your muscle, you do your exercise, and you will see the muscle will desaturate because it has to use oxygen, and then it'll move into steady state or it won't, etc., and then reset. So if you think, an all-out bike sprint, maybe you're looking at 1-2 second delay before the muscle desats. And then you think of taking a biopsy, maybe 20 seconds after that. You want to change your mitochondria because it's going to be, there's so many adaptations that are just so beneficial, you want to get them. Sprint interval training can do it. You're also aware that calorie output can train and do it, but it's going to take you a lot longer. So you opt to do the sprint interval training. So what is the best way of measuring change in order to know that things are being elicited the right way? So we'll get into NIRS in a second, but what else could we look at that would be beneficial?
So what I'm going to bring up is the incremental VO2 max testing without VO2 max.
Right, yeah, that's another option.
So
we'll get into that in a second, though. Let's dial back. We'll get to that in a second because that's super interesting. So we could use we could use power. We use power slightly differently, I think, to most other people because we're looking at the time to peak power.
Right. So I think the important thing with time is because what we're trying to measure is a kinetic process. So to be able to create power or force in the muscle, we need certain reactions to happen fast. So that speed of reaction will relate to the speed to top power, the speed to max, much more than a fixed value of power.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a good way. And I think this is, obviously from our research, we've seen this. When you do a super maximal sprint, if it's taking you 8 seconds to get to your top peak power, it's probably not a super maximal sprint. You should be, if you're in a lab condition, you've got an Excalibur bike, or you've got one of the really nice, proper configured clinical bikes, you'll see 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 seconds with a good athlete. Yeah, and then maybe 1, 2 with a reasonable kind of maybe athlete, and then then it slides. And comparative in a watt bike, that's what about 6? I mean, we see times of 6 seconds, 7 seconds, and 10 seconds. So that tells you straight off the bat that these watt bikes are not giving you the same kind of measurements that you're getting elsewhere. And it's interesting because obviously I've got some people using the Echo Rogue bike, which is kind of like their assault bike variant. It gives power data, and it's probably very on par with a watt bike. But as we know, when we bring these people into the labs, they're maybe 1 second, but the other bikes are showing 4 or 5 seconds. But that time to peak is really important because it's telling you that the muscle is under stress and how quick it's getting there. And then you have the next interesting bit about the metrics, about, I guess, of how long can they hold that power. And then we have the drop-off, and then we have the differential values and percentage changes between getting to peak, staying at peak, holding peak, and dropping to minimal value. And from that alone, if you don't have any fancy gadgets, is some reasonable data you could use.
And if the sprint duration is long enough, that hold of minimal power becomes important as well.
Yeah, which is another metric people don't use. They don't tend to use.
If you're doing short sprints like 10 seconds, that minimal power hold might not be there. But if you're doing 20-second sprint, there's a definite minimal power hold.
Yeah. And then if you're good with data and you know how to program and do all that stuff like we do, then you get into the nice idea as well, is that you can take that and run the kinetics and look at the phases, the components of phases. And we'll maybe do that in a different podcast, but that's super enlightening, because when you then add the heart rate and you get the on kinetics and off kinetics, you really start to see how the heart rate is functioning. Because this idea of, I've changed 20 beats is fine, but the quality of the 20 beats is probably way more important. If you're lucky enough and you have the NIRS devices, then you're obviously getting an insight into that localized muscle and what's taking place. Do you want to explain what NIRS is, John?
So NIRS is essentially a light beam that fires into the muscle, and it reflects back at 2 different frequencies. One frequency reflects oxygen bound to a globin molecule, the other reflects globin molecule without an oxygen. And then the mathematics behind it creates a percentage value of oxygen within the tissue.
And what's really important to understand here is that no 2 devices or brands are necessarily going to give you the same percentage score.
No. The percentage score can change day to day, it can change hour by hour.
Yeah. And it's different algorithms. So for example, Moxie will use an SMO2 to look at the total kind of oxygen saturation level, whereas Train Red, Portland will use like a tissue saturation index. But the thing about this is, once you understand what you're actually seeing, you can understand that it's all about the trend that's more important. I think NIRS is still... So, I mean, the idea is you put these on and you're basically looking to see how well is the muscle able to extract oxygen, how well so that's the utilization, how well can it kind of maybe hit a steady state, and how well can it resynthesize or kind of like resaturate back up. And that, in our first paper, we proposed a new model for that in Boxing, which people can check out, and I'll put it in the show notes. But it's a good insight into what's occurring. But again, it's another area, and we're not going to get into it in this podcast, but we might in another. It's a big area where I think it's still in its infancy and there's a lot needs to come. So you still need to take the research papers, including their own, with a little bit of a caveat on it. But what we can say is we use NIRS a lot. I mean, I think we're probably one of the few companies that uses so much of it. So we have quite a good understanding that we know when a muscle is going to desaturate, how it's going to desaturate, what the expectancy of the recovery is going to be look like. But more importantly, within that, there's a whole heap of other data, such as the slope gradient, what's the desaturation value over time, the harmonics, the mean absolute deviation, a myriad of stuff. So really what I'm saying here is there is no excuse when working with athletes when it comes to this thing, because you can get valuable metrics if you understand the physiology behind what you're...
Or if you can look at shapes.
We say this a lot. It's all about shapes. We pull some shapes. It's kind of, but that's it.
In the 90s.
Yes, yeah, this is it. Yeah, some big stories in that. Another time. But that's it. So we know mitochondrial biogenesis, we know sprint interval training can stimulate it, we know that you have to have that all-out cascade, big effort, and we know you can look at it from heart rate, you can use power data, and you can use near-infrared spectroscopy if you've got it. There's probably other things you could look at as well, but those would be the easiest ways to look at it, and from that, you can then determine how that muscle is functioning and how it's changing over time.
Yeah.
Now,
if you don't have access to heart rate or NIRS, then and the bike's not giving you power data, there's a potential that how do you know it's working? So what you can do is the test we used in the paper, the incremental time to exhaustion test.
yeah, I was just going to get to that. So this is a good one.
So this test is part of the VO2 max test. It's been in sportscience since the 60s.
At least. I think there's older papers than that, but yeah. It's an old one.
Everyone in sports science will do a VO2 max test. Everyone's fascinated by the VO2 max number.
Yeah.
To me, that VO2 max number is pointless. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a fixed point in time.
But wait a minute, John, you're going against all the other content creators. Some big name people are saying that this is a marker for longevity of life, universe, curing disease.
The VO2 max is a central marker of oxygen coming into the body. To give you an example, somebody with asthma will have a very low VO2 max score. However, their ability to perform as an elite athlete is not impeded at all. So that says to you it's not a crucial marker of performance. It's a marker of how much oxygen you can take in under stress. What's more important is the time that test takes, because that test takes you to fatigue where you can't keep up with in the case of the boxes we did, it was a treadmill. You cannot keep up with the speed of a treadmill, so you have to stop. So that's what in sports science, that's what we call volitional fatigue, when you choose to stop. That time reflects much more accurately what the adaptations in the muscle are. So you always see if training has been done correctly with sprints, time to exhaustion will increase by between 4 to 10% in sort of 3 weeks.
So we saw a 6% increase in time to exhaustion. But we should quantify this. So we did sprint interval training was our intervention, and we wanted to measure volitional fatigue. This because what you're interested in is looking at, how does muscle oxygen mitochondrial respiration change. So what we opted to do was do the treadmill test separate to the running. It's the running separate to the bikes. So there were two different. So there's not, you're ruling out that familiarization and training and all that stuff. And the way we do the incremental treadmill is very different to other people in the sense that, John, you like to start at 10 kilometers, which I love, and then we increase per minute 1 kilometer until we get to 18. And then when we get to 18, we then just go for incline. And one of the great things about the way we do it is you can take an athlete to volition relatively quickly. A lot of times what happens is when you start at 5 or 6 kilometers, there's a very slow bedding in, and the data doesn't look as good. We get really good data from this. Now, so what happens is your VO2 will rise as you'd expect, but there's a really intricate picture when you look at near-infrared spectroscopy, because what happens is when you're fortunate enough to have loads of sensors like we do, and you slap them in all the muscles, you don't see what you think you're going to see, because everyone thinks, everything runs in this beautifully symmetrical pattern, and unfortunately biology doesn't work like that. No. So every muscle will desaturate at a different pace, and then it will dip off. And when you get to volitional fatigue, you'll see it because the muscle will just go, poof, we've used everything. Now, that's only a little tiny bit of the story, because the interesting thing about this is when NIRS volitional fatigue occurs, it's usually way beyond VO2 max. So that has occurred. So systemically, that has occurred. So the question really is then, is VO2 max really that great an indicator? I mean, from a volume of oxygen consumption, probably, but from a muscle utilization Probably not. No. And it's interesting because there's a tendency for people to stop tests very early. So when the RER hits that 1.2 marker on the test, they go, test is complete, that's your VO2 max, which is fine. But when you let people go beyond that, some super interesting shit reveals itself. Yes. You know, it's super fascinating. You know, you see those athletes that can push deep and run with very low levels of oxygen utilization. You see those that can't. And then you have that beautiful, when they stop the test, this resaturation of how the muscle is able to kind of extract. That's why we use the test, because we can get a lot more out of it than just VO2 max. Because a lot of people are just using it for VO2 max and missing a whole heap of interesting things.
So even if you don't have NIRS, that test, that time on that test is a very good metric of how your athlete's performing, muscular-wise.
And the crazy thing for us was that so our process, we should probably explain this a little bit as well. It's becoming a bit rambling, but anyway, apologies. We did the incremental treadmill test, and then they came off the incremental treadmill test. We put a blood pressure cuff on the thigh, and then we created a rapid series of occlusions. So like getting your blood pressure taken, it gets inflated, except that we inflated it super quickly, like to 2 seconds to 300 mercury. So really jamming it on. You measure that for a period of time, you release it, and you repeat it. And the idea being you're looking at blood flow restriction, looking at how much oxygen is being used and subsequent recovery over time, and you should see it differ. It's all on the paper. You'll be able to read it. But the interesting thing was that when we did the familiarization and then we did the control, we didn't see any real changes in mitochondrial respiration rate. And that was kind of interesting to me, because at that point I thought, shit, we're going to see nothing out of this. John's been talking nonsense for 20 years. It's all doom and gloom, people. Let's pack up our stuff and go home. But that actually was not what happened. So just to kind of put it into perspective, Kevin McCulley and others have done this paper where they've compared the response of near-infrared spectroscopy to biopsies and looked at respiration change, and you see this curve, polynomial curve. I wasn't sure we were going to see it because we've got well-trained athletes, all the research is in untrained athletes. And I think what it showed was that in the period between the familiarization and the control, the athletes were good. They didn't change anything. Nothing get changed. So control, that from a research perspective, that box was nicely ticked off. The shocking thing for me was the treadmill runs were okay, but they weren't anything special. And we didn't change runs, nothing get changed. And then when they came back 3 weeks after sprints, they all ran longer at a higher intensity level, despite doing bike riding, which is crazy because that isn't for us, but research-wise.
It's not really. I think that actually hits on a real, this is again going off on a ramble, much like most of my lectures do. It highlights a really important point. People get fascinated by sports specificity.
Yeah.
So footballers need to do football, need to run around, runners need to run, cyclists need to cycle, swimmers need to swim. The reality is your body doesn't care where the adaptations come. As long as the adaptations you're trying to create match the demand of the sport, the body doesn't care. So transfer of bike sprints into running performance should be expected because we're changing mitochondrial function, we're changing mitochondrial behavior, we're changing muscle behavior.
And it's interesting because we saw the change and it was very, very pronounced. And remember, folks, this is like well-trained athletes. So this kind of shows again that you still can get a lot more adaptation out of these athletes than you probably think, even if they are well-trained with the right understanding of physiology and the right protocols in place. And we had this nice 160% change in mitochondrial respiration rate, but it is shown there is a change in the tissue and there is a change, therefore, probably on oxygen availability or utilization or something like that.
There's the change in how the tissue recovers from fatigue.
Yes.
That's a really important point.
Yeah. 6% increase in time to exhaustion, which is huge because some people were running for an extra 2 minutes on big inclines. So people that were maybe hitting 18 and getting to 4 incline were suddenly running at 18 right through to 6. One was running to 18 and 8. You know, you start to see these big changes, which is interesting. And the other thing is when oxygen desats, we've seen that there's a much greater, I think it's about 6% or between 5 and 6% change increase in the availability of oxygen as we went along. So there was huge adaptations in that small period of time. Now, something very, very important to understand though, because the paper doesn't do this, because the paper was just that study, was what actually happens after you stop. Because this is something I don't think people understand. It's use it or lose it.
Yes.
So, it's like
It's an
anything.
adaptation to the stress you've been creating during that training block. When you stop that training block and stop training and change how you train, the adaptations you've got there are going to disappear.
Yeah. And this is important because something I see a lot online is people that maybe dipped into some of our work or just other work in sprint interval training or whatever, talk about starting it late in a block, start it in the beginning of a block, start it in the middle of the block. And I just do it all the time. And the reason we do it all the time is you're going to lose it. You probably need 2 to 3 weeks to get it going and get a real good change in mitochondria. It doesn't make sense to me why people are doing a lot of sprints the way they do, other than I think they don't understand the physiology behind it. They don't understand how that mitochondria has to be changed, the biogenesis processes, all that stuff. So it's super important you're doing sprint interval training, that you're not just doing 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then doing none. And that's why I've seen people use our protocols and get really good results in camp, and then it dissipates off really, really fast because they just drop it.
Yeah.
So you have to really be using sprints all the time. Now, that doesn't mean you say you're doing sprints every single day of your life, because this is another thing that comes up. Once you have and built your baseline, how often should you do them, John?
So if you're looking to maintain, once a week will allow you to maintain the adaptations you've got, because you're keeping the stress in the system, so it goes, I need to keep mitochondrial levels high. If you're still looking to push but you don't have as much time available, twice a week consistently will start to get adaptations. If you've got a very short period of time to try and change something 3 times a week is what you need to do. So it depends what you're trying to do and how much time you've got to get the adaptations that you want around how often do you need to do them. And it doesn't matter if you do them twice a week. With athletes, sometimes they'll do Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. Like when we do it in the lab, we'll do Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and we'll have 24 hours between each session. But reality is when people take it, they do it differently.
Yeah, so I mean, most of the boxes I work with are doing them pretty ad hoc, to be fair. I've left it very up to them as long as they get the 3 sessions in. So some of them are doing them Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays. Some are doing Monday, Wednesday, Fridays. They just do them all the times. The only time they do not do them is before a spar session or before competition. Not because I don't think it's going to have a massive effect, to be fair. The difference being that if you are doing super maximal, it may, because you are goosed after it, you are pretty shattered. The other thing we should need to clarify here as well is that the on and off component is the critical component.
Yes. All of it, recovery.
If you're doing 20 seconds on and giving somebody 240 seconds off or 80 seconds off, that is too big a recovery to drive, unless you're trying to develop power, which is a different process to what we're explaining in the paper. That makes sense. If you have to do a maximal push or throw, you need a little bit of time to recover in order to generate that again. But that's different to when you're trying to change the mitochondria, whereby you need this massive stress and to create this kind of metabolic stress and then maintain that stress. And like we said earlier on, that first sprint is everything, and everything else is just maintaining that stress.
The mitochondria will recover from that stress of the first sprint, and we'll be back to a baseline value. So when in the second sprint, it's not a stress for it. So it's really important that you think about the work to rest ratio that you're trying to do. And that has to match your athlete as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's no point in giving somebody like James that you work with a lot of recovery, because it's not going to create the adaptation for him that he's looking for.
No, and that's it. And the other thing as well is that people understand is that the way I do sprints is very different. So I analyze the data week by week. So I'm looking at changes in their kind of performance. I'm looking at changes in heart rate. I'm looking at changes in power. I'm looking at changes in NIRS, and then I modify the sprints the following week. And the reason being, your body will plateau out on sprints pretty quick. They need to be changed very frequently. You can't just have someone on a block and say 10 off, 20 off or 10 for 6 weeks. That's just, you're not going to get changes because the body's going to get very good at adapting to it. So you really need to play around with them and mix them up. Again, that goes back to the physiology. You can't just, and this is where people go wrong, I think, with them. I think my experience the last 3 years with sprint training is it's a very individualized prescription. So all my boxers will do, up in Aberdeen, will do very similar style workout, but very different intervals. So some may be on 10 on, 15 on for 10. Poor Jimmy on this week is on, I think, a negative recovery, something like 15 on 10 for 12. Shout out to Jimmy Lang. You're doing well. And then bag sessions. So the other thing we haven't touched on, and we'll touch on another time, is there's a multitude of ways of doing interval training and sprint interval training. It doesn't need to be just purely on a bike. You can do maximal efforts on a heavy bag. There's a whole heap of things. But I think to conclude this one, because I won't go too long with this, mitochondria, you need it. You have to use it or lose it. Sprint interval training is an excellent way of getting those mitochondrial adaptations, but there are other ways. But if you get an athlete that's very time constrained, nothing beats maximal sprint training. You can just fit it in such a time period because you only need 60 seconds of work.
Yeah.
So you should not be programming 3 minutes on, 9 minutes off for like a day. I mean, I've seen some crazy programs lately where it's like 60 seconds on, 180 seconds off for 10. I'm not sure what they're trying to physiologically derive or push.
So when you go to that, you're moving away from a sprint into a high intensity interval.
Yeah, which is different.
Which is submaximal.
Yeah.
You're holding a percentage power below maximal.
Yeah. So you need to think about why you're doing it, what the rationale is, shrink down the recovery in order to create and maximize and maintain high metabolic stress, and you'll get your returns on it. Sprints also is a very psychological process, and it can really elicit between two athletes who can dig deep and who doesn't want to dig deep. And I think we're very lucky that most of the athletes that come into the labs to see us really, really dig really deep. It's a good exercise to see who in your team is prepared to go all out and who's not.
Yeah, it allows you to get an insight into the athlete's psychology around how far they're willing to go into a red for you.
Yeah. And you need that in the world of performance. But that's it, John. That's podcast number 1 done.
Excellent.
Oh, thanks for everyone for watching and listening. Hopefully it's not been hopefully it's not been too much of a ramble from two old blokes that are miserable. But anyway, and we'll see you all on the next one.